Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You've entered the weekly climate recap, where we look back at what progress is being made to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Today, we will be covering the news from July 21st to 26th. So let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned last week, the G20 environmental ministers met to discuss climate change policy. Nothing happened. Honestly, I'm starting to think that all these meetings are doing nothing but creating emissions with all the delegates flying to different locations. DeSmog published an investigative report which looked at how the meat industry's advertising and PR teams are advertising their products. They wanted to see if the industry was downplaying their climate impact, if they were casting doubt on meat alternatives, or if they were exaggerating the effectiveness of agricultural innovations. This is particularly important because forecasts say that we're not even close to hitting our peak global consumption of meat. Meat consumption will rise in developing countries as their average household income rises. The report found that the meat industry is using many phrasing tactics to kind of fudge their emissions numbers and present that dietary changes is an ineffective way to curb emissions. Overall, their methods have been very effective, particularly because top news outlets have hardly spoken about the relationship between the meat industry and climate change, at least up until very recently. And for clarification, the meat industry does have a large environmental impact. One NYU study calculated that the EU's largest pork producer, the Danish Crown, is set to use up 42% of Denmark's emissions budget by 2030. And yet the company launched a campaign last year across radio, TV, newspaper, and billboards arguing that pigs are climate friendly and that their slaughtering practices are climate controlled. I recommend reading the full report, which is linked in the source section down below. China is the latest location to experience unimaginable damage from extreme flooding. I want to start by saying that the coverage of China's flooding event was disturbingly low compared to Germany. It got a little better later on in the week, but that's not a good look, journalists. Torrential rainfall came down on China's Henan province, causing rivers to expand into the streets. This was particularly bad in the province capital, Zhengzhou, where a year's worth of rain fell in a 3-day period. This flooding event has impacted 1.2 million people and has killed at least 63 people. And now China's Zhoushan and Zhejiang provinces brace for Typhoon Infa that has just made landfall. France passed a climate law that covered a wide range of policies, restrictions, and cultural changes. Some of these include not allowing landlords to rent out properties with poor insulation. It also banned polyester starting in 2025 and phased out advertising for fossil fuels by 2025, which is really interesting. Advertising for fossil fuel. It also increased the amount of vegetarian meals offered in schools, and it banned domestic flights less than 2.5 hours long unless they have an international connection. It also provides subsidies for drivers to switch to cleaner cars and creates low emission zones where cars would not be allowed. Environmentalists like Greenpeace don't think that this law is ambitious enough for France to hit the emission reduction goals. Even though the law was inspired by the Citizens Climate Convention, some of the convention's panel members were actually disappointed by the end result. Friends of the Earth activist had this to say about the law. Quote, "Within the context of climate cataclysms in Europe at the moment, this law is an aberration. The main disappointment was a lack of a national emissions tax, giving the regions only an option for taxing polluting activity, but not requiring it. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the top lobbying group that represents the majority of the S&P 100 countries, wants clean energy standards that Biden is proposing to include natural gas. Super clean. This unfortunately has the opportunity to influence moderate Democrats, so this might be a worrying development. A new study published in the journal Nature found that the worst emitting 5% of power plants represent 73% of electricity generation global emissions. Moreover, they were finding that these plants were usually not up to efficiency standards of their country, and if they were, they could reduce emissions by 25%. Basically, emission standards and efficiency standards should not be underestimated. You can read more in the resource section below. The International Coral Reef Society, which represents thousands of coral scientists from around the world, are calling on policymakers to work fast on protecting and restoring the reefs. Their model projects that up to 30% of coral can be saved if we keep the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. A contributing author to the paper had this to say, quote, "From a coral reef perspective, we go from 30% of reefs surviving to only a few percent surviving if we don't act now. We are already faced with a grand challenge in trying to restore the reefs. Once we do eventually reduce carbon dioxide emissions and the planet is no longer warming at an accelerated rate, trying to restore from just a few percent is much more difficult." And yet, somehow, Australia's Great Barrier Reef avoided being put on the UN's endangered list. Meanwhile, a deadly coral disease is sweeping through the Caribbean coral reefs. This stony coral tissue loss disease is thought to be linked to ship wastewater, though scientists are still unsure if it's a virus, bacterium, a chemical, or something else. The disease seems to spread easier and be more deadly than most coral diseases. The Bahamian government is setting up a task force to look further into this problem. Similarly, 3 million pounds of dead fish washed up on some Florida beaches. The fish were killed by a red tide, which is when an excess of nutrients in the water produces a harmful algal bloom. This especially bad red tide is thought to be worsened by human-produced pollution. Specifically, it might have been caused by a wastewater spill from a phosphate mining company in April. That would do it. I am kind of curious if this fish kill and the coral disease are related to each other, because they are pretty close in proximity. Climate change is also causing a major fish die-off in West Coast rivers, or national rivers, honestly. This is particularly bad for salmon population, as drought and warmer waters are killing off babies. California wildlife officials have chosen to send 1 million Chinook salmon to hatcheries rather than releasing them into the wild until water conditions improve. Similarly, Montana's trout population is having a massive die-off right now. Another study found that overfishing and climate change is decimating global fish populations. 40% of the world's countries lose out on essential micronutrients like iron, zinc, calcium, and vitamin A when this happens. A lack of micronutrients can result in maternal death and growth restrictions, as well as preeclampsia. Right now, they're seeing that climate change actually impacts the loss of micronutrients for a country even more than overfishing, but overfishing should not be understated. Russian officials are officially blaming wildfires in Siberia on climate change. A regional head had this to say, quote, "Obviously, there is only one reason: global climate change. We can see how it's getting hotter in Yakutia every year. We are living through the hottest, driest summer in history of meteorological measurements since the end of the 19th century. Russia saw its hottest June recorded in history this year. The coldest part of Russia has been in a state of emergency for almost a month due to massive wildfires that are so large that Alaska is seeing the smoke. The Siberian fires are especially worrying because it speeds up the permafrost thawing beneath them, which holds wells of methane. Yikes." The Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service announced that wildfires in North America and Asia are reaching new emissions and heat records. A senior scientist said that he's never seen this many fires simultaneously, saying, quote, In the more than 10 years I've been monitoring wildfires in the boreal forests, I can't recall a period where there was such widespread wildfire activity in both North America and Russia simultaneously. The Bootleg fire in Oregon is so large that it's making its own weather. There's been a reported fire tornado. A new study by the British insurer Aviva emphasized how unprepared British infrastructure is for extreme weather events. It found that over 570,000 homes that have been built since 2016 are not built to handle future heat waves, and that more than 700,000 homes have been built in floodplains since 2009. In fact, 19% of UK properties are at risk of surface water flooding. The Aviva chief executive had this to say, quote, "A cultural shift is needed to better understand the risks from extreme weather and prepare for its impacts. We need collective engagement from government, local authorities, industry, and home and business owners to bring about this shift." 38% of British homeowners think that climate change will impact their homes within next year, and 57% think that it will impact their homes within the next 10 years. Yet only 9% actually feel prepared if their home got flooded. The U.S. Department of Energy's Loan Program Office said that the U.S. spends about $200 million on climate mitigation efforts annually, but it should be spending closer to $1 trillion a year if we want to meet Biden's climate goals. The office provides funding for green technologies that might not get funded by commercial banks until Wall Street is able to take over. Quote, "The pace at which we are deploying climate solutions is wholly unacceptable." A study published earlier this month reveals that countries that have the most toxic pollution are also the ones that are most impacted by climate change. The study analyzed 3 data sets of 176 countries and found a strong relationship between the spatial distribution of global climate risk and toxic pollution. The author said this, quote, "Vast work has been done to understand the magnitude and distribution of risk from climate change and toxic pollution separately. We wanted to know if the spatial distribution of these 2 types of environmental risk are similar, and unfortunately our results say that in general they are." The top third of these countries represent the top 2/3 of the human population, which is terrifying. And these countries are mostly in Africa and Southeast Asia. The authors emphasize that this relationship represents a larger global inequality issue and that there are many internal and external factors at play. The following are the top 10 countries: Singapore, Rwanda, China, India, Solomon Islands, Bhutan, Botswana, Georgia, the Republic of Korea, and Thailand. You can read the full report, which is linked in the resource section below. The battery startup Form Energy claims to have found a breakthrough in developing long-duration energy storage. The company says its first commercial product is a rechargeable ion-air battery capable of delivering energy for 100 hours in a cost-competitive manner and at less than 1/10 of the cost of lithium-ion batteries. And they think it will be available on the market by 2025. This could be a historical development as it will allow renewable energy generation methods like wind and solar to take over the energy sector. The global investment firm TPG announced that it has raised $5.4 billion in inaugural climate funds and has a goal of reaching $7 billion. This makes it the largest climate-focused fund in the world. It is backed by many investors including Allstate, Dow, GM, and Nike, and it will be used to fund clean energy, decarbonized transport, climate-friendly agriculture, and cleaner industry practices. Finally, I wanted to leave you with some fun reading. The IEA released a report titled Empowering Cities for a Net Zero Future, where it looks at how to make cities more resilient for the more extreme climate future and how to make cities more sustainable and decrease their carbon footprint. Cities currently represent 50% of global population, but that percentage is expected to rise to 70% by 2050. They also currently represent 80% of the global GDP, 2/3 of global energy consumption, and 70% of annual carbon emissions. Bottom line, cities are important. The report promotes digital solutions such as smart sensors and controls for thermostat and lighting, energy-efficient building designs, and increased public transit and adoption of EVs. They emphasize it's up to cities and local governments to implement these changes. You can read the full report by clicking on the link in the resource section below. And that was the climate recap for this week. Please let me know if I missed anything in the comments below. And until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. Bye for now.